We are living in the midst of a global crisis right now. But this is not the first global crisis many of us have experienced. For some, that global crisis came during World War II, when it was possible that the world we know and love could have been taken over by forces that embraced evil. But that was just the beginning for most of us, at least most of our knowledge of history. Many of us experienced the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, plane hijackings, and the events of September 11th, 2001, not to mention Korea, Vietnam, the Middle Eastern wars, everything that goes along with those. And each of these events, the global events, filled us with fear, and they filled our world with fear, anxiety, and a belief that this crisis would never, ever end. Each of these crises was met with first responders, military action, and all of the resources our nation was able to muster quickly. The current COVID-19 is a crisis unlike any we have experienced before. Our feelings of fear, anxiety, and powerlessness are heightened as a result of us never having experienced something like this. Because this crisis is something we cannot see, taste, hear, or immediately feel. There is no military response for this crisis, and it seems that our nation is not able to muster all the resources we need as quickly as we need them. And our first responders are as vulnerable to this illness as we are. It's easy to panic in the midst of all the unknowns. The crisis of faith experienced on the day Jesus was crucified was unlike anything they had expected or experienced. The light of their world was dying on a cross. The pain, the humiliation, the sorrow, and the anxiety they felt caused a crisis in their faith. This was a crisis that affected everything they had hoped for, everything they had worked for, and everything they had left behind to follow Jesus. It was easy to panic in the midst of all the unknowns. There were other people experiencing crisis that day. The criminals on the cross to the left and the right of Jesus were facing crises that day unlike any they expected. I mean, like most criminals, they just never expected to be caught. And when they were caught, they never expected to be crucified. They thought they might be thrown in prison, or they might be sent to work in the salt mines. They expected a punishment, but they expected to live. And now they were hanging on crosses, filled with pain and struggling for breath. The soldiers and many in the crowd heckled Jesus with taunts and insults. If he was the King of the Jews, as the sign above his head said, the crowd wondered why he didn't save himself. Come down off the cross, Messiah! My guess is the gospel writer cleaned up a lot of the language that was tossed in Jesus' direction that day. The criminal on one side of Jesus taunted him. Perhaps taunting Jesus took his mind off his own pain for a while. But that criminal said, if Jesus was the Messiah, he should save himself and the two hanging on crosses beside him. Well, the other criminal reminded the first that they were getting exactly what they deserved, whereas Jesus was completely innocent. Then, showing remarkable hope, the criminal asked Jesus to remember him when the kingdom of heaven came to earth. Jesus told that man that he would join Jesus in paradise that very day. Now, frankly, it's hard to know how they found breath for that conversation. The method of dying on a cross was actually suffocation. There was nothing, in order to breathe, we have to have something to plant our feet on. And they had nothing upon which to plant their feet except a little tiny sloping thing. So suffocation, which took a while, painful, difficult. But they found breath for this conversation, and we can be grateful that they did, because it was an important conversation. Because in the midst of this crisis, Jesus offered all of us hope, words of hope, while he was suffering immense pain on a cross, filled with nothing but faith that this would all work out. Jesus offered hope, because he said that day, the criminal would join Jesus in paradise that very day. And all of a sudden, out of crisis, came hope. Now, it's easy to believe that Jesus and both criminals died that day. We know that Jesus died within hours of being nailed to the cross. His body had been severely beaten. It was a surprise that he lived through the beating and the beyond, dragging that cross up to the hill. Jesus knew how weak he really was, and he knew he was not going to last long on that cross. But Jesus' death was not typical of how the cross worked. Rome used crosses for the very reason that people did not die quickly. Rome wanted as many people as possible to see the pain, the suffering, and the slow, agonizing death they would experience if they dared to offend Rome. The gospel gives absolutely no indication the criminals had been beaten. In fact, it's highly likely that the criminal to whom Jesus offered paradise that day lived for many more days. Even so, Jesus said that that man, in the midst of the last and the worst crisis of his life, would be with Jesus in paradise that day. And in that moment, even while he hung on the cross, in the midst of an incredible personal crisis, the criminal felt the hope that comes from being in the presence of Jesus. This is a time of crisis in our world. We are afraid of becoming ill. We're afraid our families and loved ones will become ill. There are people trying to make money by saying, "This is the end of the world, be afraid." They're wrong, by the way, they're wrong. And we're afraid because this illness is deadly. We're afraid because the activities and the freedoms that once filled us with so much joy seem lost to this crisis. We're afraid because we don't know when we're going to get back to normal or what normal will even look like. On this Good Friday evening, if we listen with our hearts and souls, we can hear Jesus saying to us, today, you will be with me in paradise. In this moment, we can open our hearts and our minds and our souls to the presence of Jesus and feel the peace, the calm, and the hope that comes from being so close to God. Today we can ask Jesus to remember us, and then we will know that we are completely loved. Today we can feel Jesus' presence, and in that presence experience paradise. Today we can get a glimpse of the peace and the joy and the calm that comes from being in paradise in heaven with God. See, crisis, whether it is global, local, or personal, is our opportunity to turn to Jesus and ask Jesus to remember us. On this Good Friday, when our world is caught in the midst of a global crisis, I invite all of us to turn to Jesus and ask to feel his presence. And then to sit quietly for just a moment or two. And as we sit quietly, we'll suddenly begin to feel energy surrounding our bodies. And that energy is the presence of God. That's the presence of Jesus, come to surround us with love and hope. I invite us to turn to Jesus, feel his presence, and get a glimpse of the peace, joy, and calm that is heaven. Turning to Jesus and the paradise he promises is our hope in the midst of crisis. Now, this crisis will pass. Another one will come. Because crisis is part of life, whether it is a global crisis, a local crisis, or a personal crisis. But when crisis comes, we can remember, like the thief on the cross, to turn to Jesus, to feel his presence in our hearts and in our minds, and to pause for just a moment to let that energy of God surround us, and we will know that we are in paradise. In that moment, when we feel Jesus around us, we can feel the hope that will change our lives, because we can believe that in life or in death, God is with us and we are not alone. With Jesus, every crisis can become hope. Amen.
Amen.